Hey, what's up, guys? Node Investor here. As we head into the end of another week, I want to do a weekly recap. Yes, we're seeing a little bit of a short squeeze, but I'm not going to focus so much on the rising shorts, the falling shorts, the SEC news. We will absolutely cover that very quickly, but I want to take a little bit more of a macro point of view, kind of cover the big picture, look at zoom out a little bit. As traders, very often I'm staring at shorter term time frames. Here on the chart, you can see there's a 4-hour chart. Seeing a little bit of action showing up in BTC here, last few bars here, but it's important to take a step back from time to time, recalibrate, look at the big picture, and I want to cover both the long end on the bull case as well as the short case, the bear case, as well as some pretty good discussion I had with one of the members in my group the other day regarding the altcoins and long-term investments in the altcoins and whether or not he should buy some more here or sell what he has here or just wait. And so I want to go over some of those thoughts with you guys and just kind of give you my perspective, share some ideas, some things to consider. At the end of the day, it's a very personal decision, but I want to share some insights into kind of our discussion, and I think it was valuable. I did get his permission. It was a confidential discussion, but I got his permission to share some of the thoughts we had, and so he's fully aware of this, so I'm not breaking any kind of trust there, but I thought it was important enough to share with you guys. So very quickly, let's take a quick look at the week in review. Going to the coin market cap here, this is the $1 billion plus club, which is very rapidly shrinking. At one point, I think there was over 30 names in this list. Now we have 15 names in the $1 billion club, and you can see Bitcoin has been a very flat week. In the last 7 days, 1%, but most other alts have been all over the place here. Cardano, the big loser in the week, down 11%. Ethereum Classic down 11%. Dash down 11%. And most of the names slightly lower, but has not been a positive week all around for the alts. Bitcoin has basically been a flat week. We saw some very choppy news, some reaction, some non-reaction to the SEC, kind of going into when the announcement was going to happen on Thursday, late Wednesday, they came out and they said they were going to reject a handful of ETFs that were pending. I went live. Many of you guys caught that as it was coming out. And then yesterday, they came back and they said, oh, we're going to review our rejection. And so, SEC starting to troll a little bit here. So I think most crypto investors and traders are just tired of this nonsense coming out of the SEC. This vacillating back and forth, the overemphasis on their decisions and their thoughts on the crypto space. And I understand that they have a place in the markets. They absolutely have a role. They have a lot of influence because they can approve and deny these things. But the fact that they're going to review their rejection is just a little odd in terms of the decision not being final. It's almost like when a project makes an announcement of an announcement. It's like, now we're gonna review this rejection. What if they reject the rejection? Does that mean they're going to be approved? So anyway, this came out yesterday. I'll put a link to this article here. You can get it on CoinDesk.com. But now that changes the tone again, and it's annoying that we have to keep considering this ETF, but that changes the tone a little bit because going back here, you saw the short interest continuing to rise going into this news. The ETF news officially broke the first time here, and you saw the quick pullback, the quick run up, and then right back into the box. And then not a whole lot of things changed here. The shorts continued to rise, but then we saw this news yesterday on this one candle, and that changes a little bit now because the fact that they're saying we're going to review this rejection implies, hey, maybe there's a chance of an approval happening here or a reversal of their rejection. And so that suddenly turns the tables in favor of the bulls and puts a little bit more pressure on the bears and the shorts because now there's the possibility of this coming out and that news is kind of overhanging on the market again, and there's the uncertainty around that. So it could go either way. You're starting to see a little bit of a short squeeze, a little bit of some covering here, and we'll go over the alts here shortly. Most of the trading has been done in the alt market, but all around, it's been a very slow week. I mean, we've had these wide ranges, no follow through for the most part though. And so I want to take a big picture view and kind of just step back a little bit, and then we'll dial in and look at some near-term action, some of the alts that I was trading this week. But you have to consider that in the big picture, right? This move that we're seeing right now, it's right here. I mean, it's very tiny. It's a very narrow range. The last 2 weeks have been relatively small. Ever since we had that climactic sell-off a couple weeks back and bounced off of that, it's just been this very narrow range, especially considering the news that's been happening. And so from a long-term perspective, we're still very much in this big pattern that's been forming over the last several months. There's technically a big descending triangle forming here, and this big downtrend has continued to put a lot of resistance and overhead into the market. Every time it rallies, it's created this lower high, and right now we're in the middle of this zone right now. We're right above this support between 6K and 5,800, bouncing off of that a little bit. Not a lot of volume on this bounce, not a lot of follow through to the upside. In fact, there's a lot of shorts piling in on this bounce, and we're kind of just sitting in this middle ground here. And it could go either way, to be fair. I mean, I'm not going to sit here and say this is going to break down 100% guaranteed and we're going to be at 5,000, 4,800 here in Q4, nor am I going to say that's the bottom and we're going to rally higher, because the truth is nobody knows. You can do some assessments, you can look at both scenarios and make your plan. And in fact, there's option number 3, and that is this just kind of meanders its way around and builds a new base here, and the rest of the year is just this boring sideways trading range that doesn't really go anywhere. So there's always that possibility, but there's a couple of things to consider here as we are bouncing. So I'm going to look at the bull case as well as the bear case. So obviously on the bull case, we have held support. That 6K number has been tested several times, and every time it's dipped below that, it's been very brief, and you're seeing the buyers step in there. So that's positive. We've also seen the shorts pile up here, meaning the more they're trying to sell this thing off, prices haven't really gone down, and ultimately those short sellers have to cover, which puts a little bit of near-term buying pressure in BTC and could spark a little bit of a rally. There's also the potential now for, again, ETF. We have another one in September that's going to be reviewed, and so that could be a surprise catalyst that, if it's approved, or the one in September is approved, could change the picture from a sentiment perspective and put a lot of wind to the back of the sails again. And you could see a big break to the upside if that's approved. So from a bull case, that's certainly out there. Don't want to write that off, but purely looking at the charts, purely looking at the technicals, there's no question about it. This is still a very bearish looking chart. If you have this pattern, right, you have a series of lower highs and lower lows that are forming here within this big descending triangle, which traditionally this pattern breaks to the downside. The pressure builds and builds and builds on the support, and you can see here we're coming to a little bit of a head here. This is going to really start to narrow as we go into Q4, and I expect that this pattern will likely be resolved one way or the other going into Q4. Now, like I said, we could get that third scenario where prices just kind of meander and we go sideways and remain in this choppy zone for several months. That would be bullish ultimately, because then this would set up a big accumulation zone that would support a new leg up going into 2019. But most likely, I'm not expecting that to happen because volatility has really been narrowing here. Let me hop over to another chart very quickly. Sorry about your eyes there. Going to go to the white chart here. This is the daily chart of Bitcoin, and I'm showing two things here. I'm showing the Bollinger Bands, and you can see here in the very recent time frame, these two Bollinger Bands, the upper and the lower bounds, are starting to really narrow, showing that the volatility has decreased a little bit here. That's evident with this very narrow choppy range we've seen, as well as the ATR, the average true range here. And this is a 9-period ATR, and you can see this is really starting to decline here over the last couple of days as the trading range narrows here overall. So you're seeing volatility really start to narrow here near term, and we know that in the crypto space that just doesn't last very long. We'll get those periods of small volatility, but usually you get these big moves, and you can see it in the chart here. I mean, these weekly bars are very wide bars, in most cases over $1,000 wide, and you can see here in the last couple of weeks it's been pretty narrow, just like we saw here at the end of June and that 1 week that we saw end of March, early April. That being said, if we do break to the downside, what are some areas to look at? And so I'm going to go back to some of the original analysis I did here a couple of months back in terms of how low could this go. And I remember I did a fib analysis over this whole move. There's a couple of places in the chart where you can start that retracement analysis, but I'm going to start back here during this last base. It doesn't change it a whole lot if you adjust it because of the size of the move that you're measuring, but this is what I've been looking at here. So going to the 786 level, which right now is around 4,900, 5,000. If you start this analysis a little bit lower, that takes you to about 4,800. And so it just kind of depends on where you do that. But the important thing here is this lines up very well with this base that we've been talking about here, right around that 5K number, that last real big base that we saw during that sell-off, and that was the last real big base before we had the breakout that just kind of went parabolic from there. And so a retracement back down to that level would make sense because of the multiple levels of support as well as some of the key retracement numbers that we've seen. So if it breaks lower, that still is my target. Now there's a lot of people saying, hey, we can go down to 3K, that's the last real big base. That is a good horizontal price point to be watching, but I'm still in the camp of if it breaks lower, 4,800, 5K in and around that zone is going to really be the target on the downside that I'm going to be looking for as far as finding a good low over the long term. And so that's something to keep an eye on there. The other thing to consider here is on the daily chart. Let me zoom in here. There is a pattern that is forming that we should keep an eye on here, and that is a bear flag pattern. And so on the big daily chart, if you're not familiar with a bear flag pattern, Google it. It's a trend continuation pattern. It's the inverse of the bull flag where you go up, pause, and break higher. In the bear flag, you have a move lower, and then you have this rally that just kind of edges up higher, and then you finally break that lower downtrend and you get another move lower. Now you could do measured moves on this, you can do flagpole, extend that out, but the point is you want to watch this lower trend line, because if this is just a bear flag in the big picture, then the expectation is you're going to have a continuation of the prior downtrend. So going back to the daily charts, where is this potential bear flag that I'm talking about? And it's looking very similar to what we saw in the past here. And so if you look at where the rally failed here at this trend line, you can see we had a very steep sell-off, and since then it's just kind of been bouncing. So if we highlight just this little area, this is what I'm watching here, this little bit of a bounce that we're starting to see here. Now to be fair, this is not exactly a very clean bear flag because it's just so volatile. You got these huge wicks coming out of both sides, but the overall pattern, if you look at the daily candles, the bodies of the candles, you can see there's just this slow rise going up as we bounce off of this. And this bear flag now is, you know, almost 2 weeks into it here. So it's going a little bit longer than a traditional bear flag, but still a valid pattern when you look at it from that perspective. The last time we saw something similar was the bear flag that we saw back here. Now this was a cleaner bear flag. Volume was declining as this was rising, and that again was following a break after a rejection at the overhead trend line. And so you had a big bear flag here, you had this rally, and then the subsequent drop. Now if you look at the measurements of those moves, you can see this pullback before it bounced was about 29%. Then we had this rally, took it only about 10%, so it was a very weak bear flag. And then we had a subsequent drop, which ultimately bottomed out around 23% to the downside, 22%. This most recent one, we're seeing this pullback down about 28, 27%, very similar to this last move back here. Now this bear flag is a little bit taller. You're seeing this one about 10% here on the candle bodies, but you did get a wick that took it as high as 15%, but very similar action. And so if you saw another break from this bear flag and another move down, what you do is you extend this. Let me copy this here. And if we extend this down, a break from the bear flag, where does that put us? That puts us at around $4,000 from this side. Now we just looked at the Fibonacci retracement level, so I wouldn't expect a $4,000 move, but on a break lower, you could very, very easily see that 4,800 to 5,000 Fibonacci retracement level showing up again. Another thing to consider is during the last bear flag, we had a break and it took it down about another 21, 22%. If we went down another 21, 22% from here, that puts us right around that $5,000 mark again. So just something interesting to consider. I'm not saying that this is going to break lower, but certainly the flag pattern right now, as the way the chart looks, is valid and is certainly something to pay attention to. Now, what would negate this? What would invalidate this? Well, a break above the upper bounds would really just start to reject that pattern here. And you can see we're currently testing a prior level of structure support, which is now resistance, as this bear flag bounces. And that's that $6,800-$6,900 zone. That was the neckline that formed on that big inverse head and shoulder pattern before the rally. And you can see this bear flag is bouncing right into that. And so that's going to be the key resistance level to be watching here. Let me circle that for us here. This little zone right here. If it really starts to break above that and close above that, that'll start to negate this pattern. Not saying we can't rally and then just bounce and then turn around and go lower from there, but I wouldn't be necessarily looking at a bear flag pattern because it is starting to get a little long on the tooth now, and so that's just something to keep an eye on. I'd be looking at this being negated if it starts to close above this prior resistance level around that 6,800 level. But the important thing to be watching here near term would be that lower trend line. So near term, over the next couple of days or so, we want to see this lower trend line hold. As of this recording, that puts it right around that 6,300 to 6,250 zone. If it starts to really break below that, that's going to look pretty bearish, so I'd be careful there. On the upside, if we get a surprise rally and we continue to see some upside movement, then the first target that I'm going to be watching is this trend line right here, which lines up with some prior resistance back here. And so if this can really keep going, that's going to be the first key, because we've seen this trend line, this overhead resistance, continuing to be the place where these rallies fail. So if we continue to see a rally here, that's going to be the first level to be looking at, and that's in and around that $7,500 mark right now. I want to look at a few more charts, and then I'm going to switch gears and talk about the alts, long-term investments in crypto, both in Bitcoin as well as the altcoin market, and that discussion I had with one of the members in my group here. But first, let's take a quick look at some of the other altcoins that I've been trading this week. So I mentioned this one last week. Nano continues to be one of the big winners. Several members in the group here caught this ascending triangle I posted yesterday, and you've seen a pretty good rally off of this move. A nice little 20+% rally, which is not bad in this market right now. So there are certainly still names to be traded. We're not seeing these type of setups across the board. I expect we'll get there. We'll get back to that eventually, but right now, these are far and few in between, but there's been a few of these, and this one is one of the ones that's been working out very nicely. VeChain was one of the ones I did a quick trade on, but it pulled right back, so small profit on that one there, but still setting up, so something I'd be keeping an eye on here near term. Another one is Zill. Zill has found a little bit of support here in and around that 520 mark here on the BTC chart, and it's also started to break this downtrend that we've seen in place here with some pretty good volume coming in here in this latest 4-hour candle. And so it's starting to turn up the right side, looking pretty good there near term. Wanchain, another one, it's been very volatile, very choppy again this week, but starting to test again, trying to break out again out of this downtrend that it's been in. So still technically making a series of lower highs, but it is looking a little bit positive, especially as BTC gets going here. It's good to see some of these alts not only keeping up, but trying to outperform again. It's always important to go back to the Ethereum BTC charts, because I use this as a little bit of a bellwether to signify how strong the overall altcoin market is versus BTC here. And you can see ETH, ever since that big washout low, had that bounce, and then it's pulled right back to that low, and it's just been sitting very flat here, very tight. So Ethereum is not necessarily outperforming Bitcoin here, but nor is it just dropping significantly like it was. No doubt this chart is not bullish by any means, but what I'm going to start paying attention to is, as this chart develops, will it form a little bit of a double bottom here on this daily chart? So if you start to see Ethereum outperform BTC, then you can expect that most of the other altcoins will start to play catch up and outperform as well. And so I use this as a little bit of a bellwether, a little bit of a gauge to kind of get a feel for the strength overall of alts versus BTC. As we know, they cycle. Sometimes Bitcoin is the place to be and will be much stronger all around, and other times the alts in mass are outperforming Bitcoin, and that's the place to be. And so that's always a question when you're looking at setups and trades. Right now, I'm starting to get a little bit of a sense that some of these alts are trying to start outperforming and play some catch up. One more I want to look at is ARK. You can see ARK, another similar pattern here, and just now, as I'm recording this, breaking above some near-term resistance. see if we can get some follow through. That's been the big challenge most of this last couple of weeks, is the follow through. Haven't seen a whole lot of it across the board. You've seen some quick spikes up, but not a lot of continuation from there. So we'll just keep an eye on some of these patterns as they start to develop. But the good news is a lot of these alts have put in higher daily lows, which is what we were paying attention and wanted to see here near term. So now we're waiting to see if we can get some follow through to the upside. It's always important to use these technical analysis skills. If you're a trader, if you're a hodler investor, don't worry about this next little bit here. But if you're a trader, these are the worst kinds of markets to be trading because it's just sideways. It's choppy. If you look at BTC again, there's been no continuation here for the most part. And so just does not make for some good trading. As traders, we look for trends and we look for volatility, right? We want to see some bigger moves one way or the other with some continuation. When you're in this very choppy zone, usually the best thing to do is just not trade at all and wait for the next direction, the next trend to really define itself. And then you have the wind to your back, and it makes for your trading to be a little bit more profitable and higher probability at that point. So it's important to also keep an eye on other markets. Some of my best trades this week have actually not been in the crypto space. They've been in the Forex market. So there's been a lot of movement in the Forex market here over the last couple of weeks and couple of months, really. And this week was particularly good in terms of some of the trades because they've trended and they've made for some pretty good moves over the course of a couple of days. And so that's really been the best case, the best place for me to be this week. And it's just, I mentioned that because once you learn trading as a discipline, and it goes beyond technical analysis, by the way, there's more to trading than just being able to read charts. Certainly technical analysis is critical and it helps you find setups and all that, but once you learn the disciplines around risk management and trading psychology and implementing a strategy, knowing when to get in and when to take profits and all that, it makes it very easy to start looking at other markets. Now, certainly every market's going to have its peculiarities, just like crypto, right? If someone's brand new to crypto coming from the stock market, there's going to be a learning curve. You got to get used to the exchanges and Satoshis and BTC pairs and all that stuff, and vice versa, right? If you're going into Forex, certainly you got to understand pips and spreads, and you got to understand correlation between certain pairs. But once you get past the mechanics, then strategy implementation and some of that becomes a lot easier to do if you're already familiar with trading as a discipline. And so just something to keep in mind. You can certainly take that extreme too far. And I see some guys on Twitter, and one day they're posting Bitcoin charts, the next day they're talking about wheat and oil, and then they're talking about gold, and then they're talking about the S&P and the Russell 2000. It's like, okay, there is such a thing as not focusing and overdoing it as well. So you certainly don't want to do that, but it is nice to have a handful of markets that you can go to when one gets slow and kind of hop over to the other side and see if there's some action over there. So whether that's stocks or whether that's commodities or Forex, pick a couple, and it will certainly kind of help you, because if you're just purely trading crypto, what tends to happen is when you go through 2 weeks of this, you start looking for trades and you start trying to force trades, and then you can really get into some trouble there. Just a little side note wanted to mention here for you guys. So going into the altcoin markets, we've seen these tremendous drawdowns over the last couple of weeks. If you look at the sub-billion name, the 100 million to 1 billion name, you can see in the last 7 days some of the big losers. Let me go to the losers. Nano is certainly one of the big winners, but Quantum down 14%, and these are just in the last week, and we know that this is already following a big drawdown. And so some of the questions I continue to get are, hey, I've been holding this name, XYZ name, I'm down 70%. What should I do here? Should I sell? Should I buy more? Should I dollar cost average? And so there's a lot of different strategies. Now, let me just be very clear and upfront as far as my personal opinion and my approach. There's only one name that I would ever consider dollar cost averaging into, and you guys could probably guess, and that's Bitcoin. Because of all the cryptos, Bitcoin is the only one that I really have that much faith and confidence in its long-term perspective. Most other names, while I may like them and I may think they're good, if you take a 2-year, 5-year point of view, I'm just not that confident in any other name that I would blindly hold and invest in dollar cost average for the long term. Now, that's not to say that I don't look at those other names, that you guys certainly know I do, and I've certainly invested in many other cryptos. But as far as the long term HODL, just HODL and forget about it, that's just not me. That's just not my camp. And this recent bear trend has proven why. There's names that I just absolutely liked and was very bullish on. But if you're ever up a couple 100%, it doesn't hurt to take some profits or to roll that back into Bitcoin, right? And so what do you do now? I mean, that's old news. Now you're down 60%, 70%. Maybe you're holding, maybe you bought at a low and you're still up slightly, but you're down from the peak. There's a couple of options to consider, and we had a good discussion yesterday. This particular individual had a pretty decent portfolio and has now found himself holding a lot of alts. And we had a discussion in July, and you got to remember, going back to July real quick, let me pull up the chart. This is what Ethereum looked like in July, and we had already seen a big drop. Kind of at the end of June, we were down 49%. And his question to me was, hey, I've got a lot of alts. I've got a decent portion, and maybe 60% of my portfolio is still in alts and the rest is BTC. What would you recommend? What would you do here? We talked about some names that I was looking at from the altcoin perspective, but I told him I'm very heavy BTC here because I'm not sure the alts are done going down yet. I want to see some long-term confirmation. And who would have thought that even though they were already down and beaten up, we would have seen another huge leg down here in August, right? And so now it's kind of circled back. We had that discussion again yesterday, and he said, I really wish I would have lightened up on the alts like you mentioned. Now what do I do? Now I'm really down. Should I sell here at the lows? I feel like I'm going to sell and it's going to be the exact bottom, and maybe I should just wait it out a little bit. And so here's a couple of things that I had him consider and recommend. If you, and I'm not saying do this, but if you sold everything today and you just said, I'm going to start and get a clean slate, and you just went 100% back into cash and you just sold everything, and you had that pile of money, and you said, okay, now that I've got this capital to work with, you have a clearer perspective, right? You don't have this overhang, this baggage of, man, I'm holding this name, it's down 90%. What do I do? Now you're just at a clean slate. You start fresh. You got to ask yourself, would I rebuy that name I just sold? So if I was holding Ethereum and I had cleared everything out here at $280, tomorrow, would I go back and rebuy that? And if the answer is no, or probably not, then maybe you really should consider clearing the deck, or moving that into another name, like maybe back into Bitcoin, or lightening up on it, maybe getting rid of part of it. And that's the other part of the equation there, is how much of a percentage does it make up of your portfolio? If you have a name that's down 90%, but it only makes up 1% of your portfolio, not as big of a deal as if you have a name that's down 90% and it makes up 20% of your portfolio, right? Then it's a harder decision at that point. Do you sell? Do you just wait? And so that's the other part that you have to consider. If it's a bigger portion of your portfolio, then you maybe don't want to go 100% or 100% out. Maybe you take partial off the table. The other question is, should I buy here? Maybe I should dollar cost average and accumulate some more here at these lows. If you truly believe in the project and you think this is a good value, then absolutely, right? If you're taking a long-term perspective, then this would make sense. You buy at the lows and you accumulate at better values. The question and the challenge is always, is this the low? Everybody thought this was the low back here, right? In Ethereum, we thought, hey, July was it. That was a nice double bottom. We're off to the races, and then boom, big sell-off. And so that's always a challenge. Is this the lows? Now, I'm going to wait for some better confirmation before I make any additional altcoin rallies. Does that mean before I make any more additional altcoin investments? Does that mean I may lose the exact bottom and lose a few points off the lows? Absolutely. But if I know that things are likely going to start trending higher again, I can get more aggressive and I have a little bit more confidence at that point and will hold more, as opposed to feeling like I'm guessing the bottom. And the other thing that I'm considering too is we're still within this big pattern, right? And this is, to me, the big reason why I'm not yet ready to make a decision one way or the other, because this pattern can go either way. This pattern has yet to resolve itself. This trend is still not defined. Technically, the chart's still bearish. And so if Bitcoin decides to break lower and go to 5K, then I expect that the alts would see another leg down in that scenario. And which is another reason why I'm hesitant to just really load the boat, even though I see a lot of prices out there that I'm thinking that's probably the low in some of these names. They're just so beaten up and so down, but it might not be. And you always have to consider that, hey, this could not be the low. And the reality is some of these alts will continue to drop lower and may never come back. And I've mentioned that before as well. Now, some of the good projects, some of the projects that actually have working products and some of that stuff have a little bit more of a head start and a little bit stronger looking. But in the big picture, I'm going to wait for a little bit more strength to show up. That may mean I missed the bottom. And even in Bitcoin, I mean, even if somebody was to wait until Bitcoin went, made a new high and broke above the prior high, sure, you're going to miss this huge leg up. But at that point, if you're looking for a pullback, then you're thinking the trend is now moving higher. You have a little bit more confidence, and you have at least some near-term confirmation that this will support and we're going to move higher. So just something to consider. In summary, I'm kind of just waiting for some confirmation. I'm doing trading, absolutely staying active in that end, and taking the setups when I see them and looking at those trades. But from a long-term investment, from a HODL perspective, if I have to hold anything, it's going to be primarily Bitcoin right now. Maybe some of the big cap names, Ethereum at these levels is looking attractive. Some of the other protocol names that I like are looking attractive, but who's to say they don't drop another 20 or 30% before they finally hit ultimate bottom? So that's why I'm waiting. But if you're holding and you're down 80, 90%, then you got to ask yourself those questions. If I sold today, would I rebuy tomorrow? And if I did rebuy tomorrow, what would I like to rebuy tomorrow? And maybe that's the other alternative, is it could just be a good opportunity for you to rebalance. Maybe there's names you'd rather be in and out of certain of the ones you're holding. So going forward, one thing you do want to consider is whether it's crypto or whether it's a stock or whether it's anything, whenever you make an investment, whenever you make a long-term entry, something you're thinking it's going to be a hold and not a trade, you still have to have some sort of max price to the downside in mind. And I do that with everything, whether it's crypto, whether it's any other investment. There has to be some get out of the way point, for me at least, because you always have to remember that the possibility of being wrong still exists. You may make an investment and you may have turned out to be incorrect in your assessment, and it may actually start trending lower, or there may be fundamental changes that happen after you make your investments, or market forces or regulation or whatever. But at some point, if it looks like you're wrong, or if it's dropping below a point where you feel comfortable, then it's wise to just get out of the way. And I know there's the old saying, it's not a loss until you actually sell, and it's a paper loss, and it's that's really just not a good way to look at it, because what tends to happen is you can find yourself down. Maybe initially you were thinking, I'll give this at most 20% or 30% or whatever your number is, and suddenly you're down 50% and then 70% and 80%, and you're wishing you would have taken the 50% loss and sold at the high, or that 10% loss and sold at the high. So just something to keep in mind. Always have a plan going in, have some sort of exit plan, as well as the upside, right? If there's things that start parabolic and going upside, it's always good to take some off the table, because especially in crypto, we know that it's very volatile, and if you get out too early, there's a pretty good chance you're going to see a dip along the ways and give you another opportunity to jump back on. So I hope this discussion helps, guys. I know it went a little longer than normal. Just had a lot on my mind here the last couple of days as been getting some of these questions, looking at some of these markets. August has certainly not been the funnest month to be trading in. It's been very frustrating for a lot of people, especially following the big sell-off we had. And so we'll see how September goes as we head into the close of this month. But I wanted to share those thoughts with you guys. I hope you enjoyed it. If you had any other suggestions or any thoughts around investing and hodling and the altcoin markets here, what's to do. Share those in the comments. I'd be interested to see what you guys think about that. So appreciate you guys watching. Appreciate you guys being here. Until next time, take care, everyone.